What's up, Vine? Welcome to our first ever Paint and Vine night. Today we will be working with watercolor landscapes. I'll be teaching you guys some concepts, techniques, and then you guys will be choosing your own photos to create your beautiful watercolor landscape. So follow along and I hope you enjoy. So I'm going to be showing you guys 3 techniques that will help you with your landscape paintings. The first one is going to be wet on wet watercolor. So I'm mixing right now a dark green color, adding some blue, and I'm going to be working monochromatic, which means it's only going to be one color, and we're going to decrease the saturation as we go. So right now we're going to be working on 3 techniques. The first one is going to be a monochromatic practice. So we're using one color, but we're changing the saturation, making it go from dark to light. So here I have my first layer. It is the most saturated, which means I didn't add very much water to it. Now I'm going to add a little bit more water for the second layer. So the second layer is supposed to be a lot lighter than the first, and it's kind of the same right now. So I'm just going to make the first layer even darker. And it's okay to let your water run down like this. It's supposed to be very fluid and flowy with watercolor. And then for the third layer, I'm gonna take some of the ink away, and I'm just gonna dip a little bit of water on my brush so that this third layer is going to be mostly water, a little bit of green. So this technique, when it goes from dark to light, is called atmospheric perspective, where you're seeing things in a distance, and usually what is closer to you is darker and what is further away is lighter. Now for the second box, we're going to practice atmospheric perspective, but with more details. So whatever is closer to you is going to have more details, and as it recedes to the background, it's going to lessen. So let's do the same thing And this is gonna be great practice for you guys preparing to work on your own landscape. So it's gonna get lighter and lighter. And I'll add a little bit of saturated green here up front. Great. Now I'm gonna let that dry for a little bit so that I can add a couple of trees up front here with a lot of detail, and the trees will become less detailed as I go backward. So this is going to be the foreground, most detailed, darkest, most saturated, and then the midground, less, and then the background is going to be pretty much just water and a little bit of color. Now we're working on decreasing the detail from foreground to background. So in the foreground, whatever subject matter, whether it's a house, trees, person, silhouette, it's going to be the most detailed. And usually when people are drawing trees, they like to use a dry brush technique. Right now my brush is too wet, so it's not happening. But dry brush technique works when you have the perfect ratio of watercolor and water right there. So that's dry brush. So I can try to get some of the trees with dry brush. Resembles the tree texture a little bit better. And I might even go darker and more saturated for this front tree. And then we're going to decrease in detail as we go to the midground. And if it's too dark, you can use a paper towel to dab it a little bit. And then as we approach the background, it's going to be mostly water. So whatever subject matter that you choose for your own painting, whatever is up front in the foreground, it's going to be darker, it's going to be more saturated, and it's going to be more detailed. And then everything starts to recede as you go to the back. Now for our last experiment, we're going to try to add some warm colors and cool colors. Right now we only have green and it's monochromatic, so it's all the same color, it's simple. But if you want to add different colors to your painting, usually up front it's going to be warmer, so your reds and yellows and oranges, and then as it goes into the background, it's going to be more of your cool colors, your blues. So let's see. I'm gonna mix just a general. It's gonna go lighter. And to make your colors lighter, you just add more water. The ratio is really hard to capture, so you have to just experiment, try different things, and you see how the water is running down. That's totally fine. It's part of watercolor, it's beautiful. And when we're doing wet on wet technique, which means both colors are, the paper is wet, your paintbrush is wet, everything is wet and blending together. And then the last layer, I'm going to just bring in Cool Wash. And then I might add a little bit of a blue color. The background. Great, so now once we've done these 3 experiments, we're gonna go into our next step, and I'm gonna show you some works that I have. And I'm going to apply these concepts to make this even more 3-dimensional, adding atmospheric perspective, because right now this is quite flat. Everything is the same saturation, and you can't really see the foreground, midground, and background. And then here I have a reminder for you guys. Decrease in saturation, decrease in detail, and we're going to work with a monochromatic wash. So if you're not confident with working with a lot of colors, I would recommend just choosing one color and then really mastering the dark to light. Awesome, so now I want to show you guys how I might apply the concept and technique of atmospheric perspective on a sample painting I have here. This painting is pretty flat. You don't really get a sense that you are going in perspective, that you're in that space. So we're going to add some more saturation and detail here up front. because as you guys remember what we practiced earlier, whatever is closer to you in the foreground is going to be more saturated and detailed. I've got this dark blue color and I'm going to add a couple of strokes, and that is quite saturated. So now I'm going to just use some water and I'm going to blend it into the painting. So I made a couple marks and now I'm blending it into the painting. And as you remember, the midground should be lighter than the foreground. So I'm going to just dab it with a wet paper towel a little bit so that we get a little bit more of that atmospheric perspective. And then here I might add some sort of a cliff or a rock to show what's in the foreground. I'm using some browns and reds, and I like to add some blue in there so that it's not out of place here. So right now I'm working on my foreground, and when you guys are choosing your own images, I recommend you choosing a landscape or a nature shot with a foreground that is interesting. I think it makes it a lot more fun to paint. It could be a silhouette of a person, it could be a flower, it could be a house. So now we have much more of a foreground. And I would like to add some more texture to some of these trees that are up front. And if you guys remember, we're going to add more detail to the foreground. So it's not just going to be a flat wash. I'm going to create some different textures of the rock. Whatever is up front is very detailed. And I'm going to use my dry brush technique to get some trees up front, because right now all my trees are blended together. So I want to show perspective by bringing some trees up front. And it helps when you're trying to get dry brush to work well if you have a piece of paper on the side to test it out. Make sure that it's creating the effect that you want. And then lastly, I'm just going to bring our attention here, adding a little bit more warm colors up here. And if you're working with water, you want to be aware of the reflection that might be happening in the water. And there you go. It's not finished, it's not perfect, but it is more in perspective, and I feel like it really brings out the life of the landscape. So that's how you would apply the concepts that we learned here. Alrighty, so we are going to start painting our own landscapes. We've just done a lot of practice about atmospheric perspective. We go dark to light, more detail, more saturated to less saturated, less detail. And now we're going to choose our own landscape or just nature scene. And here I have this beautiful 1-point perspective scene of this road. And this is a road that is nearby my house that I took on my film camera when I was out for a morning walk. And I love how you can see the fog in the background here. It really makes the atmospheric perspective really obvious. And I love how it's kind of monochromatic. It's really just a lot of greens here. So this will work really well for my painting today. And we're going to start by taping the corners of our paper so that we can have a nice border once we are done. While you guys are searching for your personal image, I encourage you to find an image that means something to you. Whether it's a very special place that has a special memory, or a special person in a special place that you guys travel together to. Choosing personal photos really can bring out beautiful emotions in your work. Emotions that are subconscious, that you're not even thinking about intentionally. Oh no. Okay. So I've got my border and I am ready to paint. I'm going to be sketching out the major parts of my drawing. So here we've got a road that is going to 1-point perspective. We've got some trees here. Notice how I am not sketching in detail. I'm just drawing out the general shapes because watercolor is very loose. And for our purposes today, we're not going to be working with a lot of detail. So I'm just going to get the general shapes that I see here. Also, when you're working with watercolor, you can't really erase the pencil marks very well after the watercolor is on top of your work. So you don't want to have very dark marks, just very nice and loose marks to help guide your brush. If you guys have limited budget and you're choosing what kind of brush you want to use, I recommend a flathead brush that is wider. So this is 1 inch. A lot of people think that you need small brushes to paint watercolor, but actually these wide brushes are really versatile. And so these work for a lot of different occasions. So for my color, I'm mixing some green and some black to create this dark forest green. I feel like it's very nostalgic. And I'm going to be starting with, let's see, my road is going to be quite dark. I just put down 1 wash. And then I'm going to use the same color, the same wash for this tree here on the side. Everyone has a different style, and some people are super meticulous, like to get a lot of details. I'm more of a big picture, intuitive painter, so I'm using a lot of big brush strokes. I'm going to add more water, and now I'm going to get behind here to my mid-ground trees. And then lastly, I'm going to get mostly water. Even that's too much ink. I just want a really light wash of just water. And for watercolor, since there is no white, if there is a brightest spot in your work, you want to just leave it you want to leave it just the paper's color, so you don't want to have any water or ink on it. So now I have kind of a big picture underpainting, and now I'm gonna go in there and add some more details and saturation up front. My foreground is gonna be a little bit darker. It's really amazing how much perspective you're able to capture using just one color and some water. And now I'm going to dab my paper towel here in the center a little bit because I feel like there's a lot of fog going into space, so I really want to highlight that. And then now I'm going to get my dry brush technique. Let me get my paper, see if the ratio is good. It's still kind of wet. Great. Still too wet. I'm gonna use it. So right now, even though the dry brush technique is working on this paper, it's not coming out well here because my paper is soaked with water. So I'm gonna have to wait. While I'm waiting for it to dry so I can add some dry brush, I'm going to draw this car right here. And this is part of my foreground. This is something that's really standing out. So I'm going to add a lot of detail and saturation to it. And then I'm going to look at my photograph and see what other areas have a lot of detail and depth and darkness, and I'm going to just add a little bit more saturation to those areas. So here, up front, my foreground. Okay, so now I've got my base layer painting and I'm gonna wait for it to dry so that I can add some more details. But for the most part, you can see that the colors are in place. I have what's darkest here in the foreground. And then I've got trees receding the background and the sky is the lightest. Alrighty, so now I am adding some final details to my painting. I am working with darker, more saturated colors to get as much detail as I can. Here I've got this tree up front. So this tree up front compared to the trees behind here, it's obviously a lot darker, a lot more detailed. And I've got this house back here that I want to capture. And when you're painting your photograph, feel free to take out any elements that you don't feel like is necessary. You don't have to add everything that you see. That's the point of painting. If you were replicating the photograph 100% likeness, then there would be no need for painting. Painting allows you to pick and choose the areas that you want to highlight. Then I want a little bit more detail for this tree here. Okay, moving on to the other side. I'm just going to finish up these leaves over here. And there we have it. We have our 1-point perspective. And this is the most satisfying part, when everything is complete, taking the tape off of the border, and you get that beautiful white border. Completely monochromatic, one color, but as you can see, utilizing all of these techniques, the landscape really comes together, and there you go. I can't wait to see what you guys come up with. I love the idea of everyone using the same concept and technique, but coming up with completely different paintings because of the painting that you chose. And hopefully it's one that has meaning, and it will be really fun for us to all share why we chose our photo and to share the final product. So thank you for following along.